I'm joined by Dan Mitchell. You used to be from the Cato Institute, and you've recently made a move?
Yeah, I've been at the Heritage Foundation, I've been at the Cato Institute, now I'm with the Center for Freedom and Prosperity.
Okay, and why the move?
Just when you're someplace for 11 years or 17 years, you like moving and doing something different.
Very good. Now, you spend a lot of time comparing nations. Now, in the economic reading that I've done, I love the examples from history where you've got two nations side by side that are comparable, and then they do things differently, and you see a lesson in practical applied history of how that results. What's some of the examples that you can share with us about nations that have favoured a big government and nations that have promoted more freedom and less involvement from the government?
Well, first, by way of background, the reason that I do this all the time is because it seems to be something that actually gets through the minds of politicians and their policy staff.
Yeah.
When I go in and try to convince some lawmaker why it's important to control the growth of government spending or to lower tax rates, if I'm just talking theory, every so often I feel like I might make a little bit of progress, but if I can tie it to some practical real-world examples, they feel much more comfortable. Now, I wish they would understand that theory a priori is important and valuable, but you got to work with the reality that politicians, their minds change and they can only be convinced in certain ways. So what I'll do is, for instance, I'll take Switzerland and France, or Switzerland or Italy, Switzerland, Germany, and show how Switzerland, with a smaller government, lower tax burden, more laissez-faire environment, why over time they become richer, they grow faster, there's more prosperity, more job creation, more opportunity. Or I'll compare, say, Chile, Argentina, and Venezuela. And when Chile went toward free markets back in the 1980s, their growth rates, their per capita living standards have skyrocketed, whereas in Venezuela, which is sort of like just a horrible example of statism, they become a basket case. And Argentina is sort of in the middle, doing bad policy, but not as bad as Venezuela. Yeah. And so you look at the data, not for 1 month or 1 quarter or 1 year, even 2 years or 5 years. I look at data over decades, because that way you're washing out anything that might be a one-off effect that might distort the data. Yep. But when you look at this multi-decade data on how the free market, small government countries, at least relatively speaking, how they do so much better, I think that's just incredibly powerful. I mean, look at...
It's a good example.
Yeah, and look at every part of the world. Botswana, compared to other sub-Saharan African economies, Botswana is shooting ahead because by African standards, they have a lot of economic liberty. You look in Asia, you look at places like Taiwan and South Korea, the incredible explosive growth they've had, the long-run prosperity of Hong Kong and Singapore, and you compare that to say what's happened in mainland China, which only recently in the last couple of decades has begun to move in the right direction, and you can see in the data how the more you move toward free markets, the faster you grow, the more prosperity you have.
So with Chile, Argentina, Venezuela, and Chile moved towards free markets in the 80s. Let's talk about that example specifically. First off, what kind of moves did they make towards free market? What did that practically look like? What laws did they get rid of or introduce to foster a free market economy?
This is one of the reasons why I always endorse the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom of the World Index, because that allows you to look at countries over time, and they grade countries on 5 different big categories. And of course, there's dozens of indices that go into creating those 5 categories: fiscal policy, regulatory policy, trade policy, monetary policy, rule of law, and property rights. And you can take a country like, say, Chile, and you can see how bad they were, how little economic freedom they had. Way back in the 70s under Allende, who was basically a Marxist, the government was controlling everything, nationalizing things, cronyism, no rule of law. And then you see some of the reforms that took place beginning in the 1980s, things like personal social security, privatized accounts, sort of akin to superannuation here in Australia. You look at the reduction of tax rates, the opening up to trade and private investment and private ownership, the privatization, just a whole range of policies across the board. And what's fascinating when you look at this international data, for the most part, you never find a perfect country.
Yeah.
I mean, even Hong Kong, of course, Hong Kong's technically not a country, it's a special administrative region, but whatever jurisdictions, we'll use that term,
sure,
whatever jurisdictions you're looking at, even Hong Kong and Singapore, they have policies I don't like. And if you go to some of the worst countries in the world, well, actually, I don't know of a good policy in North Korea, but I imagine some of the worst countries in the world, you might find one good policy out of 10.
Apparently they've got good national defense.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's an economic liberty argument, though, but hopefully we don't find out about their capabilities. But I find this international economic data and research and comparative analysis, I find it to be incredibly helpful in terms of trying to then, as we started out our conversation, if I'm trying to convince a politician that it's better to have economic freedom, and I just find this sort of practical, results-oriented data tends to be compelling for them, because they want to know some other politician elsewhere in the world did it and got good results. Because what do these people care about? They care about getting reelected. They care about being able to go to voters and say, oh, vote for me because I did something that made you richer.
Yeah. So if a skeptic was to ask, was it an isolated move towards free markets, or were there other things going on in the example of Chile which made them boom as a country? Was there a mining boom at that time? Were there other conditions?
Well, that's again why I like looking at multi-decade periods, not a 1 year, 5 year analysis. I like looking at decades of data because, Chile has a lot of mining, and when there's a strong commodity growth period, Chile benefits, but so does Brazil and Argentina, and yet they haven't experienced that dramatic economic takeoff. There have been periods of very high oil prices. Well, Venezuela is one of the biggest oil producers in the world. It hasn't helped. I mean, it helped Chavez and Maduro buy off voters for a little while when they had a lot of loose cash floating around, but the economy never benefited as a result. As a matter of fact, there's something in economics called the resource curse, which is that a country that has some tremendous natural resource, oftentimes that's an excuse not to do good reforms because the government can live off severance taxes and things like that.
They get covered. It gives them grace to lose money and still end up in the black.
Yes.
So how often does a real world example with comparisons of similar nations over long periods of time to smooth out the variables, how often does that get absolutely rejected because of a politician or bureaucrat's philosophy and ideology about economics? That's not what they believe in. They're socialist.
Maybe I don't talk to enough true believing socialist politicians around the world, but for the most part, that's not the problem I run into. The problem I run into is I can present tons of data to a politician who doesn't really have any underlying philosophical motivation in them, and they're simply looking at it politically. And they might decide, well, yeah, you have lots of compelling data, but I think it's politically risky, so I'm not going to do it.
Right.
That's my frustration. That's if we talk in 5 years and I've gone bald, that'll be why, because I want to tear my hair out.
Is the solution then to inform the population so that they demand smarter politicians?
I try to do a lot of that, but of course, 330 million people in America? How many speeches, how many TV interviews, how many radio interviews? I mean, yes, I tried doing all that, but I'm not under any illusion that I'm going to reach tens of millions of people. But hopefully I'll reach some people, and especially if there are people in the business community, professionals, maybe they happen to know politicians, so maybe we can change the culture and things like that. But here's my frustration, not so much dealing with politicians. It's dealing with my counterparts on the left and the left-wing think tanks and policy organizations. I do things like when we have debates at conferences and panels, I'll put up a chart showing countries that got great results by limiting the growth of government spending. Mm-hmm. I'll show that when you have a spending cap and government grows maybe 1% a year or something like that, how over time that reduces the burden of government spending as a share of GDP, and that also reduces government deficits, because you're actually, the underlying problem, of course, is government's too big, and a symptom of government being too big is red ink. Well, if you cap the growth of government spending, you get really, really strong results. And then I turn to my friends on the left and I say, okay, I just showed you a list of 25 countries that got great results by having spending restraint for multi-year periods. Can you show me your list of countries that got good results with tax increases? And then they sort of They look up at the ceiling, they study their fingernails, they do everything they can not to answer the question, because there are no real-world examples, especially over multi-decade periods, of countries that have gotten success with big government and high taxes.
And they say those countries just didn't do it right. We'll do it better next time.
That's the frustrating thing. I try to pin them down. I say, look, here's the data. I feel like I want to hold their head and have a sheet in front of them. Look at these countries that did my policies. They got good results. The economies grew faster, and compare that to your list of countries that got good results with higher taxes. And of course, that's a blank sheet of paper. And yet they say, oh, it's special circumstances. I say, well, how is it special circumstances when it's been going on for decades? How is it special circumstances that the high tax countries don't grow as fast? Now, some of them will do things like say, oh, well, Sweden and Denmark are examples. And I say, well, no. Sweden and Denmark became very rich countries when they had small government. Then when they started adopting the welfare state in the mid-1960s, then they started falling. And their growth rate went from 4% growth a year or 3% growth to 1 or 2% growth. So the policies that you say are acceptable, high taxes and big government, the academic data, the economic research clearly shows that's associated with a slowdown in growth in those countries. Now, they still have, of course, in Denmark and Sweden, very free market policies in terms of regulation and trade and monetary policy. So they might still be successful countries, but there's no question that the big welfare state has slowed down their growth.
Wow. Good answer. Thanks very much for your time. Now, if people want to ask you questions, is Twitter, Facebook, where can they find you on social media?
I'm on Twitter at Daniel J. Mitchell, but probably the number one thing I would recommend is I write a daily column on my blog, which is called International Liberty, and the easy way to find it is go to any search engine, type in Dan Mitchell blog. It's almost always, if not always, the first thing that pops up.